Hope you jump in.
Yeah. Hi, this is Bruce Rawls, and today I'm speaking again with Dr. Jeff Seibert, and I'm really enthused about today's topic because Jeff is going to be talking about Dr. Kenneth Wapnick's metaphysical chart, which is a wonderful teaching aid, and I've used it for many years, and I know a lot of other course students find it extremely helpful. And so anyway, thank you again, Jeff, for being here and talking with me today, and looking forward to this very much.
Yeah. And looking forward to this as well and sharing about this. This is, as you were saying, it's just such a helpful tool what Ken has developed here. I like to call it a metaphysical snapshot.
Yes.
It just captures everything in one picture.
Mm-hmm.
Just kind of see the whole complexity of what our ego has. Uh, Made up for us, and the correction that's there in response to that, represented by the Holy Spirit and the right mind. But yeah, I mean, there have been many different iterations of the chart over the years. When I first went to the foundation well, this first time was in 1990. Uh, that was a weekend program for psychotherapists, and they specifically had requested, much to my disappointment, they cannot talk about the metaphysics. So it wasn't until a year later when I came to do a 1 month retreat that I really had the opportunity then to see Ken do a chart, which was like an earlier version of this. And then it's like every time he was teaching on a different theme, he would have a different chart, but there was a certain basic structure to it. And the one that's behind me right now didn't actually appear until I believe it was 2011 when in large venue, a nearby movie theater in Temecula, we couldn't accommodate everybody for the On Death and Dying series 5-day program with a 1 day preceding that. But anyway, Ken had this chart developed for that program, and so that was when it first appeared. But earlier, it was 2001. There's the extended chart, which we just disseminated. That's available. Both of these are available on our websites under I I forget what tab it's
Is
under,
it, is it
but
teaching aids or learning aids or?
teaching aid sounds right.
Yeah, okay.
Yes,
I think something
yes,
like that. Yeah. I'll
yeah.
put that in the blog post too.
But this is one that ended up being in the classroom then after 2011 for the last couple of years. Then Ken was teaching 2.5+ years, and then it was always there available for when we were doing the teaching, Rosemary, Laurel, and myself. And it's just always such a helpful image for anchoring uh, our attention and awareness on the whole picture, what the course is really talking about. And I mean, I think Ken just had a way of succinctly capturing so many complex things about what the course is telling us, really essentially about the ego thought system, but capturing them in ways that uh, really, the words themselves don't carry the meaning. It's it's the way it allows you to read the course differently, I think, is what I would say over the years.
Hmm.
It's like the words are shorthand concepts to represent something that's complicated and represented in lots of different ways in the course. Um, and so for me, it's something when I'm reading the course, it's like it's always there in the back of my mind that anything that I'm reading can kind of fit into this visual display. And what do
Yes.
it's just
I would just say yes, yes, and yes.
yes, yes,
Yeah. Yeah. It is such a succinct and yet in-depth depiction of so many metaphysical ideas that the non-dual metaphysics of the course. Yeah.
yes. Because that purple line, for example, you
Yep.
mentioned
Hmm.
non-duality, and that's the line, the distinction between what comes through it, the symbols of the course that are come within a dualistic framework.
Mhm.
But above the purple line is the only reality, as Kenneth said. He doesn't have reality. I think reality may be on the extended chart. There's a lot more concepts represented on the extended chart.
Yes, I've got them in front of me, and it is online learning aids, and then there's expanded in a simple chart and on
Yeah,
the website. Yeah, so
and the
great
expanded.
resource for anyone who's studying the course. Yeah.
And I think I started to say we didn't complete the expanded chart was what he developed for the classes on the text series that he
Oh,
did
okay, like the
started
journey
in
through the text and
2001. Yeah, that
oh,
became
okay.
after the journey through the text.
Uh-huh.
But that was right after we had moved to Temecula. He had done classes on the workbook when we were still in Roscoe, but there was no video for that. And then when we moved to Temecula, he started not too long after that move on the classes on the text. And it was just as a handout at that point.
Okay.
And that's the form in which we still pretty much disseminated other than our online website. But I think what makes the chart so powerful is its simplicity. Just going to walk up to it for a moment. That's one of the nice things about having it here behind me, because I use this. This is actually the setting in which I do the weekly classes. I mentioned that this was developed for the On Death and Dying week-long program from 2011. And that's actually in our weekly classes right now. We are going through there's going to be 25, or there are a total of 25 weeks on that program to capture the 5 days that Ken was delivering this in-depth exploration of what the Course really means when it's talking about death and dying, and how we think it's about the body, but it's truly only a thought in the mind. I think, again, that's one of the concepts. Death does not show up on this chart, but it does on the extended chart.
That's such an important reminder because I always try to remember when I pick up that blue book or read the online version or wherever I'm reading the course, it's always and only about the mind, in particular the decision maker, that wonderful little blue dot at the top of the chart below the purple line
Yes,
there. Yeah.
yes. Yeah, and it's interesting. It Ken says, there's only one reference to decision maker in the Course,
Right.
but it talks about for the world to be the way we experience it. That depends on the body being the decision maker. And the sentence before that, it says it's the mind that makes decisions. So even though it doesn't say that the mind is the decision maker, if you put those two sentences together, it's pretty clear that Jesus is. He's saying the body would have to be the decision maker, or the ego's plan is that the body has to be the decision maker, but it isn't.
Yeah.
And so that leaves you with no other option, but it's the mind that's choosing. In fact, I had it open to that page. Let me just
Oh,
read
sure,
the
sure.
sentences.
Oh, yeah.
First, this is on page 17 in the manual on the shift in perception, section 2. So it's in the section, how is healing accomplished? And it's sentence 4 in paragraph 1 of the shift in perception. And it's sentence 4 says, first, it is obvious that decisions are of the mind, not of the body. If sickness is but a faulty problem-solving approach, it is a decision. And if it is a decision, it is the mind and not the body that makes it. The resistance to recognizing this is enormous, because the existence of the world, as you perceive it, depends on the body being the decision maker. So I don't think it'd be any clearer that Jesus is saying that the mind is the decision maker. So Ken lifted that concept, replacing, I guess, Charlie the Chooser, as they had been using. And Gloria said you needed something a little more dignified, refer to this
Right.
central power in the mind. So yeah, let me just go up to the board for a moment, see if that does that
Sure.
work?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, you were mentioning the decision maker, the blue circle. And that's where all the power of the mind rests. And says everything else that he's got on the chart here that's below this purple line is all, he said at the time, it's all really within this blue circle. That's where everything is happening. Everything there's nothing else really in the split mind. And of course, ultimately, even this is an illusion. That's what I believe is really kind of teetering. It's like the body isn't real, but ultimately, neither really is the decision maker. If there's nothing to choose between, what would a decision maker be? What would the choice be? So there's no decision to be made in heaven. And there's just this foolish, tiny mad idea that we thought that we had, that we could be separate. This time could be apart. That we could have an existence on our own. And that's Ken's brilliance again comes through in terms of how he reflects. He talks about the ego strategy. This is especially increasingly in his later teaching. He talked about the ego strategy that you see reflected really here, both in the wrong mind talks and in the world of separation that follows from this. That one of the things that he often emphasizes, that you can see that the world, he laid it out so that the world concepts, almost all of them, mirror exactly what's in the wrong mind. And that's really because they're just the shadow.
Yeah.
It's just the shadow of what's going on in the wrong mind, or the projection. The dream. The dream is a projection out into the world of form. So it's like there's again so much complexity in the ego thought system, so that it's so helpful to have something, let's say, that simplifies very complex teaching. Yet it's not that doesn't do a disservice to that complexity, but it just gives us a handle on a way of summarizing and thinking about what our very clever and ingenious ego has been up to and what it's attempting to do to keep us completely unaware that within the dream, this is who we are, instead of the state that you can be on here in the world. I know on the extended chart, it can also have the dreamer listed on the extended chart. And that's just another way of characterizing this. Certainly it's the dreamer, but it's the power to choose is what's so fundamental to the course process. We forget that that's really what it's trying to teach you. We just get lost in so much what the course is communicating to us about what it is that the ego has set up to confuse us. And so we'll get mired in all of the different distractions that the ego has concocted and always speak of. And we speak of the ego as it's separate from us. But it really is, it's an interpretation, as Ben said. It's really nothing more than an interpretation of this tiny mad idea of the dream of separation. And it's an interpretation that we're a separate self, but then it gets more complicated. And this is starting to say part of the ego strategy, that there's a whole story of sin, guilt, fear then. And it's interesting, the unholy trinity, again, at times referred to sin, guilt, and fear. It's like he pulled out these three particular concepts. I mean, they certainly are. You'll find paragraphs and sentences in which the terms or variations on these terms appear, but Ken's clarity in terms of pulling these three out and having them really as a focus for what the ego thought system is really all about, and what its ego strategy is, to keep us unaware that the only thing that really matters, and the only, that power to choose is all that really matters in these two thought systems. But the whole story of sin, guilt, and fear is what takes us from an awareness that we have of joy to a world where we think we're a body, and then we're caught in mindlessness rather than being mindful. Ken doesn't have mindful on this chart here, but you can see it in contrast to the mindlessness that the Course speaks about. Magic being mindless, for example. So we attempt to deal with our anxiety, our fear, our guilt by manipulating things in the world, as if those are the causes of our problems, and that somehow manipulating those things in a way to get a different outcome at the level of the world and the body is really going to make us feel better. Temporarily we do, but what we're doing, it's magic, it's mindless magic, because we're denying the power of the mind, and we're giving all of the power to the world and to the body, like what we were just reading from the manual, where it requires that the body be the decision maker. And so that's what the ego is trying to make us do, believe that it's the body and the world where all the power rests. When we're dreaming at night, it's the mind that's dictating everything that's going on in the dream. None of the figures in the dream have any power at all to do anything. They're just representing what it is that we have chosen as a mind to believe and to dream.
Yeah. And as you're saying it, I'm thinking, and the Course brilliantly reminds us that all our time is spent in dreaming. And so if we could extend what you just said to our so-called waking life, and realize that I could make the same choice of realizing that the figures in the dream that seem to be the people and the circumstances of my everyday life are also coming from my mind. Not so much the physicality, but my interpretation of them,
Yes,
the depiction of them, my interpretation, and is completely under control. And we're back to the blue dot again, right?
exactly. As soon as you're
Yeah.
talking about how we're interpreting any experience that we're having,
Mm-hmm.
they're really, again, the ego veils the simplicity of the choice.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's part of the simplicity, as I say, that this chart really reminds us of when we get caught in this ego's complexity, is that it's just a simple choice here. And so that power to choose rests here, and it's the only power that matters. We get caught in choosing different videos. We think, oh, if I could have this video rather than this video, where this happens to the body rather than this happens to the body, I'm going to be much happier. But what we don't realize is that we've already, as soon as we're trying to choose among videos, when we think which one's going to give us what we want, and we're not really conscious that's what we're doing, but what we experience here when we're trying to make choices at this level, that we're really feeding into the ego's whole strategy to make us mindless.
Yeah. Jeff, I'm giggling just for a moment when you say the choice of videos. I think that's an example of the double shield of oblivion, because on this level, oftentimes my wife and I debate over what video to watch on the TV every night, and and yet it's once removed from the other video of which thought system do I want to run through my mind's projector, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And we can turn anything into conflict.
Exactly. Yeah.
But the problem isn't the conflict at the level of form.
Mm-hmm.
It comes down to that simple choice again. Who have I chosen to guide me, or whose video really am I wanting to review?
Yeah.
The egos or the Holy Spirit? The Holy Spirit really does just simply represent a willingness to let go of my judgments, which is what forgiveness is all about. So things like the ego strategy that Ken has spelled out, where we have bought into this whole story of sin, guilt, and fear, where we think that we have attacked God somehow by being separate. The ego says, we've destroyed oneness. There's a huge amount of guilt that comes with that. We've destroyed oneness. We've destroyed perfect love. We now are on our own. We were very selfish in doing this, so there's a huge amount of guilt. The whole thing, of course, being made up. But we so much don't want to remember that this is right here. And this makes it so clear. This is, I find it so helpful to realize that if this is where I always am, and I can connect with that, like you were just saying, when we are interpreting things and we realize I'm giving this an interpretation that's not making me happy. I know that I must be identifying with the ego, and I know that there's another interpretation. That's the simplicity that there's really just those two choices. There's two alternatives that I'm only ever deciding between. So, so the sin, guilt, and fear then is part of, Ken has played this out, pulling from different sections of the course. He gives this kind of a linear perspective on what's happened, as if it's something that's unfolding over time, although it really does just happen in an instant. But what it does is it makes the mind such, and the seeming power of the mind to have separated becomes so terrifying that we feel like we need to make that unconscious and escape from it. And that's then where the world comes from. But we don't really escape from anything. We just seem to live in the shadows of it.
Yeah, exactly. So that repression then is what caused that curved line that's labeled projection to go from the wrong mind down to the prison of the ego's prison of the world of separation, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. But the ego has told us that the Holy Spirit is spiritual, but as Ken has pointed out so very clearly, ego's real fear is to know the Holy Spirit or love, because separation can't know oneness or love or even its reflection. But it's afraid of our power to choose against. And so this just makes it so simple. Again, you can get lost in, there's so many words in the course. You can get lost in that, but when you start to have this snapshot in mind, you start to read things, you begin to realize all of them are just different ways of saying the same thing over and over again. So that's the real value then. Certainly for me personally, I'm a visual person too. So from the beginning, when I saw the charts, it was like, oh yeah, this my mind can really grab onto this. This is going to be very helpful. The key always, though, is kind of saying it's one thing to master the metaphysics and to really understand it. And I knew after I went and did a 1 month retreat in 91, the year before I joined the staff. When Ken first presented his chart, I remember in the first week that I was there, because the year before we hadn't talked at all about metaphysics. But when he first presented the chart, it was like, what is this? I don't get what he's talking about. But he's just every program that he did across the month that I was there, he was always drawing a chart, talking about a chart. And little by little, it began to sink in. And that's I still have this, I'm looking back at a pretty superficial level, but enough that I could go back. I was working with the Center for Attitudinal Healing at that time. I was part of staff who were students of the course. And so I shared the chart with them. But it's one thing, as I said, with only just beginning to get a grasp of metaphysics. I mean, it's just barely taking that first step with it to appreciate what he was saying. But you can master the metaphysics, but you don't put it into practice. And so it's sort of, and so this has to be a tool for our practice, not just for our intellectual study of the course.
It's a perfect visual aid for both the theory and the theory part of the class and the lab part of the class, to use a high school college metaphor, right?
Yes, exactly. Yes. Yeah. Because you gotta learn the practical applications and implications of it, or it's just going to be a mental exercise that has no value really. And we'll remain just as miserable as we've been. And in fact, then we can use it and add it to the ego's arsenal. That's just another device to use for attack.
Right.
Criticize others when they're not doing it right, when they're not saying it right, they're not appreciating all the subtleties of this. So it's the key, Kenneth said over and over again. And he actually moved away from the chart for a while after they moved to Temecula and after doing the classes on the text, and I guess on the manual, we call it the classes on the manual. But then for a while there was no chart. He wasn't doing much drawing of anything. But at some point, I think he just came to the realization that most of us still needed this visual aid. And the unconscious mind, I know that, what year that was, that might have been the years before the On Death and Dying one, but he started to use the chart again in his teaching. I think he realized that we just weren't far enough along to hang on to the metaphysics of the course without having some kind of a visual aid. And so that just became, not that he used it in all of his teaching, but more and more he began to return to that, because I think he just saw that this can be so helpful in making sense of, again, what otherwise could just seem so overwhelming.
It is a great tool for generalizing the concepts and the principles in the course, because like you say, it's not that many words, each of which is a symbol, but each of those symbols relate to so many other things that really are equivalent in each of the two thought systems.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And you can, I mean, when I was doing some teaching, I would always use the chart, but based on the theme, I used to attach other concepts in each of the boxes, and sometimes on here just to tie them in with the specific theme that might be focusing on looking for from the course as the basis for a class. The another distinction that's very important, of course, that Ken got captured in this chart as well, is the distinction between form and content. And the ego is all about form. And that's where, when we're listening to the ego, that's where we focus our attention. That's how we can take something, the chart itself is form. And if our focus is simply on the form, then we use it. We can use it for attack. There's nothing holy about the chart.
Right.
It's just a form, and it depends on what purpose we give it. And so that's the question of content. And again, there's that simplicity that there really are only two contents. It doesn't show that here, but that's implied in this: the ego content or the Holy Spirit's content, the wrong-minded or the right-minded content. And we can begin to recognize then, when we are getting caught up in the form and we're worried about whether or not we're getting the form right, we're down in mindlessness. And that's telling us we've completely forgotten where the real power rests. And we really do think that we feel the way we do because of what seems to be happening here in our lives. And you can't deny that that's experience. We do feel that. But the course's challenge is to persuade us to at least entertain the idea that maybe we're wrong, that our interpretations, when they're based on attributing how we are feeling to whatever seems to be going on in the world of form at the level of the body, are just simply wrong. They're mistaken. And of course, that gets us to the other side, the correction, when we are willing then to recognize that maybe we are wrong. That's the correction represented here by the reverse of the arrow of projection, which brings us down into the dream, and we're identifying with it. And it is referred to this in various ways, but it's like our attention or our self-concept. The ball is really our self-concept.
Our focus of attention, basically.
Yeah. And identification, focus of attention.
Yes. Yeah.
So this moves. The power of the mind, the decision maker, the dreamer remains there, but the attention, our attention, our identification can shift. And in fact, part of the ego strategy is, once we've identified with the separate self, then we listen to the ego's story that we're sinful and guilty. Fear that follows on that. So now we're a sinful, guilty self, we're a fearful self. We need to escape from that because we believe that there is this angry God who wants to avenge our attack on him. And then we shift our identification and our attention down to the world of form, our identification with the body. And so this is now where we are essentially then caught in mindlessness. And again, the whole purpose of that is to keep us unaware of this is who we are. We're the dreamer, not the dream figure. That's the Course in Miracles, and that's the miracle that allows us then to begin to recognize, when we are caught down here, what really is going on. It doesn't have anything to do with what seems to be happening down here. We feel like we're imprisoned by our experiences down here in the world, our circumstances. what's going on in our body or the bodies of those around us. And
It's sort of like that's Plato's cave allegory. We're looking at the shadows underneath that
right,
veil of forgetfulness, right?
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, yes, yes. But it's an illusion of a prison
Uh-huh.
because, and this is what the miracle helps us recognize, it reverses the projection.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds us that we're not a body, but a mind. Now, we're not asked to deny that we still continue to experience ourselves as a body,
Right.
but what Ken is saying over and over again is that you can still recognize that you have a choice in how you're going to look at whatever it is that you're experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how, you can look at how you're interpreting it, as you were mentioning earlier. And that is what always then brings us back to this choice point when we realize there really are only two interpretations. And that's similar to the two contents then. Ego's content and ego interpretation, which is always seeing differences, always seeing attack, always seeing victimization. Or there's the Holy Spirit's content of forgiveness, which is an interpretation based on sameness, ultimately a reflection of the fact that we're all just one.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, just like when you are dreaming at night, all of the figures in the dream are coming from my mind. So in the end, we'll have that kind of awakening to a realization of awakening. Everybody who seems to have an independent existence and have their own power to choose, these still are all just projections of one consciousness here. That's another term. Don't think it's on the extended chart, but Ken in some places talked about this being consciousness. So that's another term that can be used to apply to the new circle. There is no consciousness, certainly not as the Course defines it in heaven. There's pure awareness,
Right.
but consciousness implies a self and another.
Right.
And
Subject and an object, that kind of thing.
An object.
Yeah, yeah.
You're in the realm of duality, then
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
not non-duality. So the miracle, anyway, is just that Ken says it doesn't even make the choice for us. The miracle just reminds us that there is a choice. And that's reminding us of the power of our mind.
Mm-hmm.
It gets us back in touch with what really matters, so that at least maybe for a moment we step back from trying to decide what to do at the level of the body and realize the problem is I'm not at peace. I'm not listening to the wrong teacher. I've chosen the wrong voice to pay attention to. And so, again, that's the simplicity of this, and the chart, I think, just reflects it so clearly.
Mm-hmm.
It shows the various layers of the problem that the ego has concocted for us to try to get us farther and farther away from this vision point and this power. You choose this rather than this. But the miracle, just in its simplicity, just forget about everything that's going on at this level. It's not what's really having any effect on how you are feeling in this moment. Mm-hmm. It's the choice here that you've made, and it has this little red arrow that comes off here that represents that decision to believe the ego, to believe this thought system, and identify, pay attention to and identify with this whole thought system, and then it's resulting projection out into a mind.
A few years ago, I think it finally clicked after many years of listening to Ken and reading. And it finally was like, well, the world isn't the problem below that line of the under the veil of forgetfulness. That's not the problem, because that's actually just a reflection or a shadow of the ego's projection and repression of that horrific thought of sin, guilt, and fear that our minds can't tolerate without Holy Spirit's help to look at. And so the ego isn't even the problem, but it's that little red arrow, the moving the blue dot over, following that little red arrow in the chart over into the ego, and saying, and in that moment, we have become powerless, at least in terms of what we think we are, even though our real power is still there in that circle that, but we've just focused our attention on an identification, like you say, on the ego, and now we seem like we're stuck, and yet the Holy Spirit says, God thinks otherwise, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
The ego says once you've done this, you can't undo it. It's permanent.
right. That's
Yep.
sin instead of error, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And it can't be undone. You
Uh-huh.
now are apart. So how do you get back when you clearly are separate?
Yep.
And of course, the body, you can see it's a brilliant part of the strategy because the body, as we then experience ourselves in others' bodies, is really then riveting our attention in the
Hmm.
world
Hmm.
with an experience of a self. It's clearly physically apart from everything else.
Yeah.
So it's such a convincing witness to
Damn
see.
convincing is at times, huh?
Huh?
Damn convincing at
Damn
times.
convincing, yeah. But only in a sense that's because we want to be convinced. We still
Exactly.
want it to be
Exactly.
real.
Exactly.
You know,
Yeah.
it feels like it's sucked us in, but no, we are the ones that said that
Yeah.
we want this to be our reality, and we're willing, to deny our own power to choose.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just
Just as a reminder, Jeff, but we actually have a little over a minute left. I know the time
oh,
flies,
I know,
doesn't it?
thank you. Yeah.
But you've covered a lot already. I know we could go many, many, many hours in just using the chart and all the details, but I think you've given a excellent overview. Any last quick comments that I'll get on the top level overview before we run out
Well,
of
I
time?
do one last thing I didn't get to that I did want to mention, and that's we talked about prison, but the other thing is classroom. Here again, actually the course only uses the word classrooms plural once in I think it's in chapter 2,
Okay.
and but Ken, he's recognized just how incredibly helpful it is, rather than just say, well, it's all just an illusion.
Right.
He's helped us recognize, no, this is our classroom. The
Yeah.
course talks a lot about our lessons,
Yeah.
and the world then becomes a classroom rather than a prison, and that is just so helpful
Truly.
to not to deny what we're experiencing, but to see that this will now become the means in which I then can recognize which teacher I'm listening to. And
Exactly.
so that because this is where I see my projection. I can't get in touch with this because I've made this unconscious, I'm mindless, but I can see its effect. And if I listen to the Holy Spirit, what I then can do is use that effect as a way to get back in touch with what the cause must be, which means I've chosen the ego.
Exactly.
And so
Thank.
that's kind of just to come full circle. Then that's how we reinterpret the world. There's two interpretations